Wow, well, that's quite an act to follow. Thanks very much, Nick, and thanks very much indeed, Michael, for the welcome. And thank, please, Peter and Nick for the conference of Monash and Itati, and also thank them for realising that the spaces in between are as important, and so that the hospitality has been so generous and made the occasion very special. Not entirely in jest, I think what follows should be dedicated to York's greatest export after Alcuin, and I refer to the polo mint, which, as those of you might know, is the mint with the hole. And I feel very much that there's a hole between my macrocosm and my microcosm, but please bear with me. So it's now almost 50 years since Sir John Eliot referred to the uncertain impact of the discovery of the New World, the discovery of the New World on the Old. And my paper this afternoon returns to this paradigm to consider specifically how, by discovering how to describe the world, as Joan Paul Rubiez put it, alluding to Burckhardt's belief that the Renaissance witnessed nothing less than the discovery of the world, historians of the early modern missions, such as Danielo Bartoli, helped to transform the West's self-understanding of Christianity, and thus of itself. For some time now, historians have been aware of the role played by such writers in laying the foundations for the subsequent birth of ethnography. However, I prefer to view the enterprise in the contemporary context of the dynamically reciprocal nature of the cultural exchanges between the old and new worlds which took place as a consequence of the European expansion over the 2 centuries after and beyond after Columbus's first transatlantic voyage. The tsunami of literature that this provoked took myriad Latinate and vernacular forms. Carefully edited missionary letters, copiously illustrated volumes of sacred geography and topography, histories of missionary and religious orders, collective and individual saints' lives, theatre and epic poetry. Such stories provided entertaining yet uplifting listening matter for the religious and refectory, both male and female, consolation for those Roman Catholics who were living under oppressive regimes, and encouragement for those on the confessional frontier. They also encouraged the diffusion of the other Indies trope, as missionaries in the Old World claimed that their task was every bit as difficult as that faced by their New World counterparts. The cumulative effect of such literature and experience was to recalibrate not only what it meant to be a Christian in the Old World, but also ultimately, I would argue, understanding of the meaning of religion itself. My approach today is informed, at least in part, by the work of Guy Strumser, Hans Kippenberg, Tomoko Masuzawa, and others, who have lately begun to uncover for us the scholarly discovery, or invention, if you prefer, of religion as an epistemological category, amenable to comparative study. Of particular interest to me this afternoon is to argue for the recognition of what was in essence a reciprocal relationship between Western Europe and the wider world. Emblematic here is Alex Cooper's study, Inventing the Indigenous, Local Knowledge and Natural History in Early Modern Europe, a study that shows the degree to which the influx of and knowledge about unfamiliar plants and minerals brought back by merchants and missionaries from across the globe provoked among Europeans the discovery of the indigenous natural world before their eyes. This complemented the awareness shown by the Jesuit missionary José de Acosta in his widely disseminated missionary manual De Procuranda Indorum Salute of 1589, and his insight that even the wildness of the most barbarous native Indians he had encountered in Mexico and Peru was as nothing compared to behavior of the ancient English as described by Bede. This insight that what they, the New World Indians, now are, we were once, long ago, was behind the striking juxtaposition in Theodore de Brie's widely disseminated, multi-volume, illustrated collection of travel accounts, De India Occidentalis, of the painted bodies of Algonquin Indian savages with the similarly tattooed physiques of their ancient Britain counterparts. Before I go any further, it's time to move on and say a few words about Bartoli, my protagonist, born in Ferrara in 1608. The first 3 volumes of the 5 Bartoli completed of his unfinished Storia della Compagnia di Gesù were on Asia. The first volume was on India, appeared in 1653, although Book 3 was devoted to the religion and customs of Japan. Then the volume totally dedicated to Japan in 1660, which was principally concerned with tracing the number and identity of those who converted and were martyred during the Christian century of 1540 to 1640, made famous by Charles Boxer's classic account of the same name, which was first published as long ago as 1951. And then the 3rd volume on China in 1663, which also included discussion of the missions to Tonkin and Cochin China. And this took the narrative from Francis Xavier's abortive attempt to reach the Chinese mainland in 1552 and continued down to 1640, which also marked, conveniently, the first centenary of the Society of Jesus. The final 2 volumes of the Historia completed by Bartoli were those on England, which was issued in 1667, which he introduced as Europe's Japan, and which reflected his focus on the persecuted church from the advent of the Henrician Reformation in 1533 to the death of the first Jesuit director of the English College, Robert Persons, in 1610. Bartoli's final volume, Italia, appeared 6 years later in 1673, and only took the narrative down to the election of the 3rd Father General, Francisco Borja, in 1556, and as such overlapped considerably with material that Bartoli had already collected for his Lives of Ignatius and Borja himself, the first of which appeared in 1650, and which should be considered, I think, as the first volume of his history of the Society. Again, this blurring of hagiographical and historiographical genres. We have it on Bartoli's own account that he was a reluctant historian, referring to his Historia as mia lunga e incredibilmente noiosa fatica. It was evidently his occasional treatises which were much closer to his own heart, several of which were most probably based on material that Bartoli had written when he was a teacher of rhetoric in Parma and elsewhere in northern Italy, and after that as a preacher who was much in demand throughout the Italian peninsula, until 1648, when the Father General forced him to retire from his duties in the pulpit for reasons of health and charged him with writing the Historia. The most popular of these occasional works, which had Queen Christina of Sweden among its many admirers, was L'uomo di lettere difeso e emendato, which is printed no fewer than 8 times in 1645 alone and translated into French, German, Latin, Dutch, and English. This treatise argued for the virtues of solitude and the need for the true man of letters to retreat from the life of the court. Like those avatars of heroic freedom, the ancient philosophers of antiquity, such as Diogenes and Crates, who are presented by Bartoli in intensely visual language as astounding curiosities, who still live, still talk, still teach, by means of their saying and actions. The man of letters should scorn earthly possessions and liberate himself from ambition and fear. Throughout the period when he was composing his global Historia of the Society, Bartoli, who shared with the painter Salvator Rosa, whom he knew and to whom the Florentine edition of the L'uomo di lettere was dedicated by its printer, they shared a love of the world as a theatre of marvels, with particular emphasis on its terrible or wild beauty, its orrida bellezza. And he continued to publish a series of occasional works, including La povertà contenta, descritta e dedicata ai ricchi non mai contenti, which is very contemporary, La recreazione del savio in discorso con la natura e con Dio, and La geografia trasportata al morale. As Helen Langdon has compellingly suggested, in their use of striking paradox and arresting visual language, they were intended to unsettle the reader's perception of the world, thereby provoking an awareness of its deeper underlying unity. If Bartoli's literary and scientific works may be seen as having in common a celebration of the underlying unity of nature in all its awesome variety and mystery, then how might his hagiographical and historical works be characterized, and what do they tell us about what I contend to have been the far from uncertain impact of the New World on the Old? As already been said, I believe that recognition of unity and variety is also central to this part of Bartoli's oeuvre. This was accompanied by a commonly used rhetorical figure of speech, the synecdoche, which involved using the particular or part, whether it be an emblematic life or even miraculous feature of nature, to illuminate universal themes. One is dealing here, of course, with ekphrasis, the type of speech or writing that is specifically designed to appeal to the audience's visual imagination. This, combined with the rich tradition of the spiritual exercises, where in the second prelude, fifth exercise, first week, Loyola wrote, and I borrow here the Italian translation, vedere con l'occhio dell'immaginazione quegli enormi fuochi e le anime come dentro corpi infuocati. Secondo punto, udire i pianti, urli, voci, bestemmie contro Cristo nostro Signore e contro tutti i suoi santi. Terzo punto, sentire con l'odorato fumo, zolfo, lezzo e putredine. Quarto punto, sentire con gusto cose amare come lacrime, tristezza e il verme della coscienza. Quinto punto, provare contatto come quei fuochi investono e bruciano le anime. What is the role played by history in the Jesuit curriculum? In what context would Bartoli have encountered history during his training as a Jesuit? Until relatively recently, the scholarly consensus was that history played a very limited part in the teaching program of the Society. However, Paul Nellis has taught us that by focusing on the Society's printed program of study, the Ratio Studiorum, which was finally published in 1599 after extensive consultation and trialling on the ground, we have been looking in the wrong place. The Ratio clearly valued history, above all, for what it could do to contribute to the well-stocked preacher and controversialist arsenal. This was primarily in two forms, both for the exemplar, its content furnished of great and nefarious deeds, as well as for the stylistic models provided by classical historians. But there is but a single reference to the importance of ecclesiastical erudition to those reviewing theology in private study in the Ratio. And it says, quote, such students should make sure they become thoroughly competent, docti ac prompti, not only in theology, but in all the church-related learning that theologians especially ought to have. Nellis brilliantly reroutes our attention by drawing us to look at the teaching of Cicero in Jesuit colleges. And it was precisely because, he argues, the 1599 edition of the Ratio had been so filleted of specific injunctions by the process of exhaustive consultation that the colleges had a need for textbooks that provided material for students to work with. One of these was the Antwerp Jesuit André Schott's book on how to study Roman history using the works of Cicero. In the words of Nellis, Schott's textbook offers nothing less than a survey of ancient history as viewed through the prism of Cicero's life and writings. And of direct relevance to Bartoli, I would say, is the following passage from Book 4 of Schott's work. Quote, there are, as I have said, two kinds of interpretations, the first of which translates something into another language, but the second illustrates by means of amplification ambiguous or insufficiently explored passages of a writer. This the Greeks called paraphrasis, which produces the greatest benefits both in reading and in writing. In writing, paraphrasis instills a habit of full and clear diction, for concise speech rarely escapes obscurity. In reading, it easily disentangles knotty points, and when, as it is said, you are gasping for air, it makes the mind of the author fully understood, end quote. What has struck me in my reading of Bartoli's Giappone, especially coming as it has after my reading of the volume on Inghilterra, which he wrote immediately afterwards, is precisely his use of amplificatio to communicate the topsy-turvy world of Japan, which, by inverting the expectations of the reader and listener, engaged his audience's attention. A well-known example of such a treatment of non-Western cultures is the late 16th century Portuguese Jesuit Luís Frois, his treatise of the striking contrasts and differences between the customs of Japan and Europe, to give it its full title. But this remained unpublished until 1955. And Frois's other work, such as his History of Japan and his manuscript Annual Letters, do not employ this rhetorical trope of what we might call the topsy-turvy. Incidentally, I was interested to discover when preparing this paper that the first use in English of topsy-turvy comes in around 1555 from Richard Eden's translation of Peter Martyr's De Orbe Novo Decades. However, for all the contrasts, Bartoli was careful also to emphasize the correspondences which existed, he believed, between Japanese and Christian society. In particular, he followed the widespread tendency in European accounts of the time to project onto the Japanese a religion which is identifiably Western, with its parallel hierarchy, monasteries, monks, temples, processions, and sacred books. And even at one stage he uses the word teologia japonese. In this he was, of course, following, albeit in a more attenuated fashion, one of the very earliest reports about Japanese religion given by the French linguist and mystic Guillaume Postel in his Des Merveilles du Monde of 1553, in which the French scholar argued that the Japanese were basically Christians, albeit ones who'd forgotten much of the true Gospels. As it happened, the Japanese, in their own way, returned the compliment by regarding Christianity as deformed Buddhism, a supposition which appeared to be confirmed by the fact that the missionaries also came from India, which had been the source of Buddhist teachings almost precisely 1,000 years before. Although, as John Rubies has recently shown in his analysis of the so-called Yamaguchi disputations of September 1551 between Xavier and some of his colleagues and some Buddhist monks, one is speaking of a dialogue only in the sense of finding some common ground for disagreement. Moreover, in the course of the conversations, the Sorbonne-trained Xavier was careful not to analyze the diversity within Buddhism as in any way analogous to the diversity then tearing Latin Christendom apart. But one needs to actually bear in mind the fact that between 1598 and 1650, no fewer than 91, mainly martyrological works on Japan, were published in Western Europe, including 2 plays by the ubiquitous Lope de Vega. So that Bartoli had precedent when he moved on to write his volume of the History of the Society in England after that of Japan. Pedro de Ribadaneiras, Historia Ecclesiastica Cisma del Reino d'Inglaterra, had explicitly juxtaposed the flourishing state of Japanese Christianity with the deplorable state of that in England in 1593. In many ways, the most interesting things which Bartoli had to say about Japan did not actually appear in the volume of his Historia dedicated to the archipelago. Instead, they found their way into Book 3 of the first volume of on Asia, which was for the most part dedicated to India. Bartoli began literally at the beginning with his account of how the Japanese themselves described the beginning of the world. Their Genesis story, if you like. Bartoli went on to describe Japan's geography, its climate, which he reported was very similar to that of Sicily, though much windier, before giving what was overall an ambiguously positive assessment of the Japanese people, essere di vivace e sottile ingegno, quanto niun'altra nazione nel mondo. Here, as elsewhere in his volume, dedicated exclusively to Japan, Bartoli emphasized the Japanese fierce code of honor unto death, and indeed ritualized suicide is naturally mentioned. And this provided, in Bartoli's view, an excellent basis for martyrdom. In contrast to the Christian converts in India, the Japanese were, on the whole, Bartoli averred, much more constant and indeed tenacious in their new faith. Indeed, Bartoli never lost the opportunity to emphasize the nobility in both spirit and blood of the Japanese martyrs, both young and old. and this detail alone strongly suggests to me, at any rate, that his audience was intended to include the noble pupils attending Jesuit colleges, the same students who would also have taken part in the Jesuit famous Latin plays, many of which were on subjects taken from the most heroic early Christian period of history. The longest two entries in the index to the first 1660 edition of Giappone are accordingly to Donne Giapponesi Memorabili per Virtù, and their Christian names constitute a veritable roll call of early Christian heroines Maxentia, Marta, Tecla, Susanna, Monica, e così via, and then to Tormenti straordinari dati ai cristiani. The list of tortures, which runs to 1.5 columns, leaves little to the imagination, from the straightforward being slowly burned or frozen to death, to the more convoluted having sulphur poured into one's ears and up to one's nostrils until one choked to death. As we've just seen, Bartoli's general comments on Japanese culture were, by contrast, overwhelmingly positive, and they recall the remarkable opening paragraph of the section on Asia, to be found in that founding text of global history writing, Giovanni Botero's Relazioni Universali of 1595. As may be recalled, this began with a paean to the continent as follows. Questa è la parte più grande e più nobile dell'universo, più grande perché il suo continente solo avanza l'Africa e l'Europa di gran lunga. Before going on to say that the continent witnessed not only all the events of the Old Testament, from the creation of man and the fall, but also, obviously, the events of the New. Then continuing, hanno avuto l'origine l'astrologia e le altre scienze che I greci imparano ai ebrei, fenici, magi, brahmani. And after enumerating its wealth of cities and the nobility of its inhabitants, he concluded with a listing of all the rare and precious commodities that had their origin in Asia, from pepper to cinnamon, cloves to nutmeg. In contrast to Bartoli's volume Inghilterra, where he stuck resolutely to an analytic format, with the year being described prominently on the margin of every page, Bartoli's Giappone is arranged simply in 5 books, each of which was named after the reigning shogun, which called to mind the fashion for parallel chronology that included measuring time by using the regnant year of the pagan persecuting Roman emperors, as well as Anno Domini, when recounting the history of the early church, as promoted by others, among others, his Jesuit colleague, Denis Petot. The terminus adquem, which the volume shared with that on China, 1640, coincided not only with the first century of the society, but also with the final destruction of the Jesuit mission there. Moreover, in the text of Giappone, save for a transcription of the relevant passage in its original Latin from Gregory XIII's Bull of Privilege, which confirmed Jesuit monopoly over the Japan mission, one finds no reference whatsoever to sources in the margins. Instead, one gets just brief descriptions of the topic about to be treated, and so in the 19th century reprints they are deployed as chapter titles. In this, Giappone shares a feature with all the other volumes in the Historia, save for those dedicated to Europe, namely Inghilterra and Italia. Though it's only the former volume, which, as I have said, offers what is in effect a history of the persecution of the Catholic Church from Henry VIII to the death of Robert Past Persons in 1610, only this volume makes explicit and consistent marginal references to archival sources, most of which are still to be found in the Jesuit archives in Rome and London. The volume on Italy, which ends, as you will recall, with the election of Francisco Borgia as the third Father General in 1565, makes more reference to printed works, although there are several references to Polanco's unpublished chronicle of the early history of the Society. And this points, I think, again to the audience and function of the Historia, which was first and foremost to situate the Jesuits for the Jesuits themselves, and especially Jesuit scholastics and nobles attending the literally hundreds of colleges throughout the Roman Catholic world, and place them at the very heart of the story of the making of Roman Catholicism as a world religion, as heroic protagonists of the global Catholic Reformation. These Jesuit scholastics were being taught in colleges both inside and outside Europe, and the distribution of copies of this Italian not Latin text, in Jesuit libraries way beyond the Italian peninsula raises interesting issues, I think, about the enduring role of Italian as an international cultural lingua franca in the post-Renaissance world. Not for nothing did Giacomo Leopardi refer to Bartoli as il Dante della prosa barocca. In addition, the countless exemplar which studied Bartoli's text also provided a cornucopia of material for the Society's preachers. Finally, and here I've only time to mention the fact, Bartoli makes frequent reference to the role of books as printed on the Jesuit press brought from Europe by Alessandro Valignano, and their printing in Japanese script, and the book's role in sustaining this increasingly threatened Christian community. The books included not only lives of the early Christian martyrs, but also spiritual works such as the Imitation of Christ and, of course, the spiritual exercises. Finally, it's been argued that such volumes as those by Bartoli were also about raising money from potential patrons, as well as recruiting potential missionaries. But I remain to be convinced of the latter in particular, because the demand over supply, as reflected in the literally thousands of letters sent by hopeful young Jesuits to the Father General. Bartoli himself, for example, wrote no fewer than 3 of these letters requesting to go to the East, and of course they were not accepted. In the case of the 2 volumes on Europe, Bartoli found himself having to defend the Society against detractors. With Inghilterra, he was dealing with primarily Protestant and Catholic enemies, but with Italia, the rival accounts are pretty much exclusively Catholic, and Bartoli's apparatus criticus was correspondingly lighter. However, there was still a perceived need to defend the Society from its Catholic enemies, as may be seen from the preface to the reader to Bartoli's Life of Loyola. In it, there is a striking passage in which he refers to the double nature of his project, which is not only a history but apologia. He continues, "There is no shortage of pens and tongues, belonging not only to innumerable heretics, but also to a great number of Catholics, who in 1,000 ways, in both writing and speech, attempt to make the Society despised by the world and held in public contempt, per mettere in dispetto al mondo e in pubblico vitupero la compagnia." In the case of the volume Giappone, the principal target of Bartoli's polemic was, unsurprisingly, missionaries from the rival mendicant orders, in particular the Franciscans and the Augustinians, who'd started to arrive in Japan in 1593, but who, of course, famously provided double the number of martyrs than did the Jesuits, among the 26 put to death in Nagasaki in 1597. Hence the account of this notorious major event, which several historians see as a turning point in the so-called Christian century, passes almost without mention in Bartoli's text. I end as I began with Sir John Eliot, who in his final reflections to a conference held to mark the 500th anniversary of Columbus's first transatlantic voyage made the following plea. "There is no more crying need at this moment than to observe the observers, with the same sensibility to historical context and environment which we pride ourselves on possessing when we come to reconstruct the world of the observed." Almost a quarter century on, Eliot's call has yet to be answered in any systematic way. Goethe, who could be concise when he wanted to be, once memorably said, "He who knows one language knows none." Less than a century later, Friedrich Max Müller, scholar of Sanskrit and founder of Religionswissenschaft, declared, quote, "In the history of the world, our religion, like our language, is but one out of many. And in order to understand fully the position of Christianity in the history of the world and its true place among the religions of mankind, we must compare it with the religious aspirations of the whole world." In other words, a person who knows one religion knows none. Although, as a professional historian, I'm all too mindful of the danger which comes from remembering the future, which of course is the curse of hindsight, and that it's all too easy as a consequence to indulge in Whig ancestor worship, make-believe. But nevertheless, this afternoon, I've tried to convince you of the legitimacy of my project to trace the reciprocal dynamic which, I believe, underlay the early modern antecedents of this attempt to relate to other non-Christian religions, as reflected in my case study, The Incomplete History of the Society of Jesus, written by the Ferrarese Jesuit Danielo Bartoli. Thank you.